I also curious about when you are creating these formulations, how many times have you just walked away fully, ruining a lab coat or something in terms of permanent
Well,
dye
all my
development?
lab coats are destroyed pretty much.
We are back for another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. Today we have Valerie George, who will be speaking with us. We're going to cover some hair care basics, I would say, maybe. A little bit on the hair care dye space, which is a huge gap for me. So I'm very interested in discussing a little bit more. But as an introduction, Valerie is a cosmetic chemist and a science communicator, educator, leader, and avid proponent of transparency in the beauty industry. She focuses on the latest research in hair care and hair color at Simply Formulas, an R&D lab located in Dallas, Texas. Valerie is also currently the Area 3 Director for the Society of Cosmetic Chemists, as well as the two-time past chair of the California chapter of the SCC, past chair of the Committee on Scientific Affairs for the National SCC, and is the recipient of the Chapter Merit Award for her services to the Society. She enjoys sharing her love of ingredients with others and can be found doing so in her monthly advice column, Dear Valerie, which is published in Happy Magazine, as well as the co-host of the Beauty Brains podcast. Welcome.
Jennifer, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, I became connected with you through somebody who I think saw a piece because, like you have in your introduction, you enjoy sharing about ingredients. And their message to me was very succinct and simple. It was, she is an expert in hair care. You have to talk to her. So I was like, all right. And it was funny because during our first call, we did start to talk a little bit about what you're doing now and your contract services that you offer in terms of manufacturing. And again, hair dye was something, even though I've formulated a lot of different products, has never really been on my radar in terms of the basics. I'm completely, they're lost on me. So, so I'd love to start a little bit. Actually, let's take a step back. I like to hear about how episode guests got into this field, especially when I'm looking at somebody who probably has equivalent tenure in the industry. And, my entrance was really on dumb luck because there wasn't a lot of outreach in terms of, hey guys, you can do this with a college degree. So, how has your journey progressed so that now, you're the expert in hair care sciences?
Well, a little bit like you, I didn't know that cosmetic science was a career opportunity because when I was in school, I did biochemistry. You either went to medical school, pharmacy school, graduate school, or got a job in quality control somewhere, or worked at like a medical device company. And I went to graduate school, and after, I said, I'm done with this. I wanted to move to California where the weather was quite warmer. And so I was like, okay, there's a lot of biotech in San Francisco, San Diego. Let me head to San Francisco. Well, San Francisco, it turns out, is very cold. It's nothing like the show Full House. And I thought, I can't move here. It's too cold. It's almost feels colder than like West Virginia, where I was living. And so I said, well, I'll never be in California again. Let me head down to LA. I'll rearrange my trip. And it was 80 degrees in January in LA. And I thought, this is exactly what I was talking about. I'm going to move here. The energy was so great. And so I started looking for a job in biotech because that's what I was focused on. And I was like, wow, there's not really a lot of biotech jobs, but there's a lot of cosmetic companies hiring. And I thought, wait a second, I can get paid to make lipstick for a living. It really blew my mind that was something chemists were doing. And I thought, why didn't they ever tell us about this when I was in college? So I got a job at a skincare line and it was fine. It was very interesting. I really liked the more logistical aspect of it versus like the product development and, being in, what's so sexy and this and that, it was all right. So I saw Paul Mitchell was hiring and I thought, okay, well, skincare is nice, but, I'm not like super excited to wake up every day and do that part of it. But I do like hair because I have a lot of it. It's very thick. It's very long. And so I thought this could be cool to do something different. And I got a job at Paul Mitchell, and I instantly fell in love because with skincare, what I didn't like about it was I was never certain if what I was doing was paying off for
Hmm.
people because you're using anti-aging products. You're using things that you hope reverse damage that has already been done. And that's very difficult to do. And
It's
on the
not an
prevention
instantaneous result.
aspect, you're not going to remember a face cream you used 10 years from now.
Yeah.
You're just not, right? Like, oh gosh, thank goodness I used it. It paid off because you're going to look how you look. So the thing about hair is it's very instantaneous. And like your hair either looks good after using a product or it doesn't. And
Yeah.
I like that immediate control that we had over improving people's lives. And when you have a good hair day, you're unstoppable, right? So I really like that aspect of it. And then Paul Mitchell saw I was very good at chemistry. And they said, can we train you to be a hair color chemist? Hair color, you have to learn from another person. It's like nail polish, perms, self tanners, like really niche things. Like it's a trade that you have to get from another person. So I apprenticed under an individual who had retired and was willing to share all of his knowledge with me. And that's how I learned hair color. And it really was a great fit because I love chemistry. I love hair.
Yep.
And I actually don't have a favorite color because I love all colors. So,
Okay. All right.
yeah. Yeah. So I was like, perfect.
It's really funny you bring up selecting a place to live based on climate because today I spent, I live in the Northeast, and today I spent swapping out my wardrobe for the winter wardrobe. So
Yeah.
I'm here cold, chilly, regretting that life decision. So let's go into the hair care basics. So, again, like the learning this is really it's a skilled trade, right? You had the guidance of somebody. I have not met a tremendous number of chemists that work predominantly in hair dye. What are some of the really like the basics of hair dye, the types, kind of what different areas can hair care science expand into in terms of hair care dye?
Hair color is generally classified by product type in terms of the longevity that the color is going to give you. So permanent, demi-permanent, which is actually primarily a North American term, and semi-permanent and temporary. And so permanent hair color is just what you think it is. It's permanent. It changes your natural hair color with a new hair color pretty much forever, where that is where it's applied in the strand. Demi-permanent is somewhere between, it's semi-permanent, it's kind of temporary. There's a little bit of longevity to it, but it's not quite permanent. And this generally lasts between 4 to 6 weeks. Semi-permanent is reserved for generally vibrant, fun colors. It doesn't require a chemical reaction. It can last as little as, a handful of washes or many washes, depending on the type of color that you get. And the color that you see is the color that you get out of the tube. If you see blue, you're going to get blue hair color. And you can just apply it and it colors the hair. And then temporary truly is temporary, like one shampoo. Think of like a hairspray or a root touch-up makeup applicator.
So when we talk about those differences in dyes, this is really like a surface chemistry when it comes to the temporary, right? You're just coating a hair fiber versus the more permanent, which,
is a chemical reaction. It's very, yeah.
So are you replacing you're replacing the melanin that is currently in the hair fiber, or how does that chemistry work?
Well, it's exactly that. You're replacing your natural hair color, you're removing it, and you're simultaneously depositing a new hair color. So let's say I'm a medium brown colored hair person and I want to become a redhead. I just can't put red on my hair because color is additive. Anytime you put color over color, you are just adding color together. You're not necessarily getting rid of the old color. So unless I want to have reddish brown hair, I need to get rid of that brown. So in permanent hair color, it is a chemical reaction where you take a ammonia-based or monoethanolamine-based cream, something that has a really high pH. You mix it with hydrogen peroxide. This creates a chemical reaction that destroys the natural pigment in your hair called melanin. That melanin gets degraded, it breaks up, so it's no longer a color. Your
Hmm.
hair strand is essentially colorless, but that ammonia and hydrogen peroxide also, while it's degrading your natural pigment, it catalyzes dyes to come together and form a color inside your hair. So in this case, if I wanted to permanently color my hair red, I would be getting rid of all this natural brown in my hair fiber, and red dye molecules would be forming during this chemical reaction. Over a certain period of time, usually 35 to 50 minutes is what this reaction takes to occur to completion.
Yeah.
The color would be removed from my hair. I would wash any excess product off, and I would be a redhead.
And when you have the lack of colorants, is that the bleaching process? So someone like me, for instance, if I want to go lighter, I would need to go through a process, which this is funny, and I should maybe in the final cut show the picture of when I decided to go to that like gray purple that was really trendy a few years
Oh,
ago.
wow, that's fun.
Well, it was, except for when I had to dye my hair lighter in order to get there. It took multiple, I had to do a lot of applications. But after the first application, I kind of looked like Freddie Prinze Jr. in that like live action Scooby Doo. It was like
Oh
really
my
bad,
gosh.
or like an Andy Warhol. It was just like
Yeah.
awful. But so, when you talk about it, to me, that seems very complex that, when you're going to make your hair color a different one, not only are you going to have to destroy that melanin, but then you have to have the reassembly of a pigment within the hair that, it seems like puzzle pieces that have to go together. And the cadence of it seems to, are the treatments generally multiple step because of that cadence in which the, destruction plus reformulation of a pigment happens? Or is it a multi-step
Well,
process?
if I were just using permanent hair color, it's one step. You
Okay.
mix two items together, usually the alkaline hair color combined with the hydrogen peroxide. That mixture is catalyzed, and you can just paint it on the hair and you're ready to go. If I wanted a completely drastic color change, like let's say I want to be a platinum blonde and I'm a brunette, or I want to have pink hair, that is a totally different type of chemistry because you essentially have to scrub all of the melanin out of your hair fiber to get to blonde.
Okay.
So you either have this like platinum blonde canvas to work with,
Yeah.
or you have a platinum blonde canvas to then put something really vibrant like pink on top of. And this actually would use bleach or lightener, depending who you are. Some people call it bleach, some people call it lightener, but it's a completely different chemical reaction. And that would be multi-step because you first have to lighten the hair and then you say, okay, now I'm going to put the fun color on top of it. Whereas permanent hair color is one step and the results tend to be, I would say, like a little bit more natural looking.
Yeah. And when we talk about the differences in permanent, temporary, and even just thinking of the different colors, are there different categories of colorants that you typically use? Not dissimilar to color cosmetics when you have certain, acid lake or, when we talk about dyes for hair, what are the colorants or categories of colorants and dyes that are being used in each of those different hair dyes?
And a lot of people think I'm similar to color cosmetics. So I'm working with actual pigments. They're
Yeah.
sparkly, they're fun. And that's not really the case. If I were doing temporary hair color, that employs pigments because they actually physically stick to the outside of the hair fiber with a polymer. But when we're talking about permanent color, demi-permanent, and semi-permanent color, there are general classes of categories of molecules that you can choose from. It's actually a pretty limited palette. And essentially, if I'm doing, let's start with semi-permanent hair color. I don't want it super permanent. This tends to be really vibrant type tones. These are a class of dyes we call direct dyes. And this is because you can directly see the color of them. So when I weigh out a direct dye from a container, if I'm making a blue semi-permanent hair color, the dye itself is blue. If I'm doing purple, I'm either adding something that's physically purple or I'm putting blue and red together, but the end cream is actually purple itself. These don't require a chemical reaction to show color. The molecules are already colored, which is pretty convenient, and it can just be put on the hair. The
Yeah.
downside is these don't alter your hair's natural pigment. So if you have dark hair like you do or I do, you're basically going to get your brown with the colorant applied on top. And so generally people like to pre-lighten their hair first so you
Mm,
can take advantage of these vibrant dyes that are directly colored called
yeah.
direct dyes. In demi-permanent or semi or permanent hair color, these dyes require a chemical reaction to form. This is because when they are showing color, the molecules are very big. So they come kind of taken apart, and you use the hydrogen peroxide to assemble them together. And so if you took a cream of permanent hair color, it actually wouldn't have a color to it. It would be cream colored, it would be off white. And then when you add the hydrogen peroxide, it then turns brown. It then turns red. It then turns some sort of shade of blonde. So this is a very specific category of colorants called oxidative dyes because they
Yeah.
require oxidation with hydrogen peroxide in order to be a color.
And so you said there are kind of a limited subset of the dyes that you can use to create the end, but obviously varying levels can create different degrees of warmth in terms of brown, black, red. And, just listening to you, is this development cycle in creating a dye a very arduous process because you don't know what you're going to get until that reaction takes place on a hair? So if you're making a color cosmetics, right, you notice you put it on, you say, oh, this is a little bit too yellow. You just kind of go opposite that spectrum, add a little bit of, the red, blue to maybe reduce that. But when you're testing product, you really have to formulate it and then go through that 50 minutes, right, on a hair truss to see,
Yeah.
and then say, okay, what am I going to adjust? Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. So
Okay.
and usually we're talking emulsions here. So it's
Yeah.
basically, it takes a few hours to make. And, you add the dyes around the beginning and you finish everything up. And then you just can't put it on hair. It usually kind of has to settle for a day. And then you apply it to hair the next day, usually a hair tress. And then you wait your, 35, 40, 50 minutes, whatever the directions are for the hair color that you're using. And then you evaluate the tress and say, well, that didn't turn out. So I'm going to do this all over again. Color cosmetics, you would just adjust with more pigment,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if it was, if it were too messed up, you probably would start over or whatever, or you would use that as a dilution somewhere. But with hair color, if you don't like the color that you made in the lab, you kind of have to start over again.
Okay.
Yeah. So it takes a while.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's one of those passed down anecdotally, because if once you retain the knowledge, right, in terms of, okay, this mixture is going to produce this, if I adjust this, then it becomes, a little less time consuming. And I think for someone like me, just listening to this, I was like, oh God, no, I could never.
Well, it just takes getting familiar with everything in order to be a little predictive. But even then, sometimes it doesn't work out. And what you see on a hair tress may not translate to hair because everyone's hair is different. Light passes through it differently, different fiber diameter, different contributing pigment. There's a lot of factors. So even if I like what I see on a swatch, that doesn't translate to real life.
Yeah. And that leads really nicely into kind of this next segment of, really how hair structure, that interaction of either the composition, the porosity, even pH effects can impact the delivery of color or the color outcome. Hair care in general, I find to be very difficult because creating a product for a mass product, I think is very difficult because of the differences in either damage, exposure, how we treat our hair. When we now talk about dye and that variability in terms of an outcome, especially so visual, right? How do you think about product development, dye product development in terms of hair composition?
Well, really, it's just like any hair care product. You have to figure out, what types it's best for, what types it's not best for. If somebody has a lot of gray hair, a color is going to look very different than if they had not a lot of gray hair and the same color is being applied. So there has to be a lot of upfront conversation about what it is we want the color to do, who it's going to be for, And then there just has to be a lot of testing because it is a chemical reaction. Sometimes people have things in their hair that impact this reaction.
Yeah.
Sometimes even on the same head of hair, it looks different in one spot than the other. They have lots of damage at the tips of their hair, but where their hair is growing fresh out of the scalp, it's not so damaged, so the color looks different. There's a lot of variables, and it really just comes down to the testing. But in terms of chemical differences in the composition, again, it goes back to the longevity that you're looking for and whether or not a chemical reaction is taking place when you're applying the product to the head. So a product like a semi-permanent color, either like a natural brown conditioner for the hair, something fun like blue, purple, pink for the hair, those are generally in conditioner bases. They don't have to have a specific pH necessarily. We're not swelling the hair to try to get these dye molecules in. They're interacting with the surface of the hair fiber, and they're pretty straightforward to do. When you have the colorants that require a chemical reaction or a longevity that requires a chemical reaction, then you have very specific parameters that you have to work in. So a high pH. You want to swell the hair fiber in order to get these unassembled dye molecules to penetrate inside. That's how you're going to get permanence. You need this high pH to get the hydrogen peroxide active. Hydrogen peroxide is stored at a low pH. It's activated at a high pH when you mix it into this hair coloring or hair lightening product. So thinking about those things, the nice thing about hair color is you can't get too cute because this really is a chemical reaction. And so you can't say, oh, let me be different and do this. It's like, nah, we kind of have all the same stuff to work with. You can't add these like really sexy ingredients because they probably don't do anything. They probably get destroyed in the chemical reaction. And so they're generally kept like very simple.
Okay. I was going to ask about any additive ingredients. Just going back a little bit to gray hair. Why is it that gray hair is very difficult to dye? That is, kind of marketing wise, and I don't know if it's true because, again, really lacking experience in this space. But it seems to be a significant challenge to, have full coverage on gray hair. Is there something to do with that hair structure, the lack of melanin or eumelanin in the hair fiber? What makes gray hair so difficult to color?
The gray hair conversation is actually a very interesting one in the hair science circles because some scientists will say, well, I did all these experiments looking at the mechanical properties of gray hair, and it's the same as pigmented hair, so there's no difference. But then we know from experience, and other scientists have validated this, that gray hair is different. It's a little thicker, coarser, wirier.
I mean, you feel it. The second I have a gray hair, I know it doesn't want to play nice, So
yeah, it's not like the other hairs. So we know that it's a little bit different. Salon professionals will tell you it's different. Consumers will tell you it's different. So in my opinion, it must be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
The challenge with gray hair is it is a little morphologically different, and it's harder to, I'll say, like bust open and get these dye molecules in. Some gray hair is okay, but it's almost like when it really becomes a gray hair and it's like, I've decided I'm going to be a gray hair forever. It's almost like at that point, we call that like resistant hair where it doesn't want to be colored. I've heard different theories about how, the cuticle structure is different. You can't get these molecules in. And so stylists have all these tips and tricks. That is the reality in some cases. We actually see it. I think the real challenge is when you are coloring someone's hair, you have varying degrees of grayness. So people are classified by percentage. Oh, they're 25% gray, 50% gray, 100% gray. The problem is they could be 50% gray here at the temples and they could be 0% gray in the back. Or maybe they have a random patch out here that's 100% gray and the rest is 50% gray. So you have all kinds of degrees of stuff going on the head, but you're putting a color on, right? And so you kind of have to make this color work for hair that's already pigmented. You have to make it work for hair that's 100% gray. And the color either ends up looking too dense and dark and inky in certain spots, and really hollow in other spots. And salon professionals, the value of going to a salon versus home hair color, they use the same chemicals and ingredients, but a salon professional can say, okay, well, there's more gray here. Let me do a different formula to
Yeah.
try to get it to match. But the reality is one tube kind of has to do the job of a lot of things. And so in that aspect, I think coverage is a little bit difficult. Also, I will say hair color it's a science. It's
Mhm.
also an art. And so getting something that looks natural,
Yeah.
that truly is 100% coverage, that doesn't look too solid, too inky, too much like carpet, where it's just like one solid
Yeah.
color.
Where it's like, yeah,
Um,
that's 2 shades too dark. That's not your natural color.
yeah. I mean, those are the types of things that you can do to get coverage. It's, so that's where it's like an art. Okay, how
Yeah.
do I get this to go together with all the right elements so that on most people, if they had 100% gray hair, it looks awesome. If they had 50% gray hair, great. If they had 25% gray hair, this color is probably not for them.
Yeah.
So it's understanding what's in the bottle, the nuance of it going together, and most importantly, who the ideal candidate is, because the reality is not for everybody.
Yeah. And I think, we're speaking in like wide generalization saying gray, right? There is a gray scale in terms of how gray, if it's on the darker to lighter. So I can see where, it's not necessarily that morphologically it's difficult to address, but the diversity of hair color results in maybe some patchy outcomes.
For sure.
So, in everything you're talking about, it seems that this is a somewhat destructive process, right? You do have to kind of raise the scales of the hair to, destroying the melanin. Um, but why is it that I recently took my mom to the hair salon and she had her grays covered up. And then afterwards, her hair was so shiny. There's something, in the process, even though, a lot of people believe that damage is being done, that the immediate after, I know the times that I've had dyed my hair before, it's felt very soft and also very shiny. What happens that makes the outcome seem like your hair is very healthy when you go through a dye treatment?
You're right that hair color, hair lightening is very destructive to hair. That's the reality of it. And I will say the fact that it does feel soft, the fact that it does look shiny is an illusion and it's a perception. I'll tell you a story. When I first opened my lab, I had a project that included buying a lot of home hair color for the work that I was doing for a customer. And I ended up having all these packets of conditioner left over because when you get a home hair color, it comes with a little packet of conditioner. I haven't dyed my hair for many years, but I recall when I would do it myself that the conditioner was so amazing. And I was like, okay, well, I'll use all of these because I don't feel right just throwing them away. And honestly, the conditioners were not that great. And I thought that's weird. I remember them being so good, and everyone says,
Yeah.
oh, it's so the best. But when you actually look at what is in a home hair color conditioner packet, it's literally just an ordinary conditioner.
Yeah.
When you are coloring your hair, though, your hair is swollen. It feels very rough. You're getting all the dye out. The hair is as razzled up as it could be. Then when you put the conditioner on, the hair feels really smooth, sleek. It's evenly coated. It's lubricated. These conditioning agents are swarming all over it. And you're like, wow, my hair feels really good because of this conditioner. And it really, I think, is a disparity between what the hair was like when it was being colored
Yeah.
and when the conditioner was put on it. As far as the shine factor, I think it's the way that light reflects off of the hair and diffuses through the hair fiber. Color does play a role in how light is able to interact and travel with our hair. And so partially that plays a role in how shiny hair looks after it's been colored. Of course, you are probably putting a really great conditioner on afterwards. Usually salon professional products have shine agents in them. And sometimes if you are at a salon, they'll put like a toner on the hair that maybe has some direct dyes, and those also can create a lot of brilliance on the hair.
Yeah.
And so that immediate effect is like, wow. And then a couple days later, after it washes off, you're like, oh, okay, my hair is destroyed.
Makes
So that's what's
sense.
happening.
I feel like that can apply to a lot of different things in terms of like that disparity effect. We're like, oh, it's terrible. And then this one thing makes it slightly better. And you're like, it's a miracle. I
Exactly.
never really thought of it that way. That's interesting.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. You know, things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
In terms of the products, though, that are applied after, what is your take on the credibility and science behind products that claim to either, have the ability to prolong color or, again, the tinted shampoos and conditioners to upkeep maybe a certain type of blonde or brunette? How are those products legit?
Yeah. With color protection, what the objective is to keep as many of the dye molecules as possible in the hair fiber. Dye molecules dissolve in water. So it doesn't matter what shampoo you use, if you just get your hair wet, if you're going swimming, getting in a hot tub, dye molecules will interact with water and then come out of the hair. So the goal is to minimize this water-hair interaction. And you do this by incorporating ingredients that minimize that. One example, I think the most classic color protectant that really is the gold star is amodimethicone. It's a positively charged silicone.
It forms
It sticks
film.
to hair,
Yeah.
forms a film. People don't like that it sticks to hair. They say, oh, but it's going to cause buildup. If you color your hair, you want it to last through a shampoo because you want that protection from the water. And so from that perspective, I would say they really work. There's other ingredients that can form a film on the hair. Quinoa protein is one that has been substantiated for color protection data because it forms a film.
Yep.
Cationic
using guar, right? There's
cationic guar, oils, almost all conditioners are color protecting because again, they're loaded with oils. So they're minimizing this water interaction with the hair fiber. So those are legit. The products that are for enhancing brown hair, red hair, blonde hair, and they already come colored, those are using those direct dyes that I spoke of. And so those direct dyes are generally positively charged, and they're going to stick to the negatively charged hair and leave a little color film on the hair that's very temporary, lasts through a wash or two. And this is going to enhance the appearance. So it's not necessarily color protecting, but it is help, maintaining the level of color that you had because all hair color will eventually fade.
Yeah. And, something that I'm not well versed in is really the safety and regulatory considerations when it comes to hair dye. So just preliminarily, what are the differences between how hair dye is packaged, manufactured, safety considerations versus cosmetic products as a whole?
Hair dyes are interesting in that they are very regulated, and the actual dye molecules are some of the most studied ingredients in the world for consumer safety. And I think the regulatory constraints and the safety considerations are why we don't have new hair dye entrants to the market. It's multi-million dollars to invent a new dye. And animal testing is required to ensure some kind of modeling for human safety. We don't want humans to be the test subjects for that. And so for that reason, we probably won't see new hair colorants come to the market. So kind of what we have is what we have. But what we do have is very highly studied to be safe. And every geography in the world regulates them. And I think they have a very specific set list of rules to find out in what you can use, what levels you can use it at, where you can put it on. Not all hair color can be applied to any hair on your body. Certain ones can only be applied to your eyebrows or eyelashes versus your hair. And in the US specifically regulates hair dyes separate from colorants. Colorants are actually really regulated in the United States. Hopefully the Tagra Biotech listeners know this, but I think the FDA is like the most strict regulatory body for color in the world. Every lot that comes into the US has to be tested, but hair colorants fall under coal tar dye regulations in the US and Canada. So they're regulated a little bit differently, but nonetheless, they are regulated for use.
For cosmetic products, right? You have to do, well, you don't have to do anything, but the recommended thing to do are things such as RIPT.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
You know, is that the same for hair dyes? What are those battery of tests that you are required to do or are recommended to do in order to launch into commercialized product?
So the regulatory framework I just mentioned is laid out in what I can use, how I can use it, intended use. There's all sorts of warnings that you're required to put with hair colorants. So that part is really easy. It's very structured. It's very systematic. In terms of go-to-market considerations, usually the tests that are required are definitely stability. Hair dye does shift over time in a tube. You want to make sure your emulsion is good. You want to make sure you understand how the color changes over time to manage consumer expectations. Generally, with hair colorants, RIPT is not conducted, maybe on an emulsion without dyes, but the reality is hair colorants, whether they're oxidative or direct dyes, some people are sensitive to them. Yeah, so you may necessarily have like a false reading if you did an RIPT test, let's say, because the product itself is not a challenge. That individual may just be sensitized. So it's generally not done. It's also not intended to be applied to skin. It's intended to be applied to hair. And for that matter, even most hair care products, generally RIPT is not a requirement for safety. You also don't generally do preservative efficacy testing if it's an oxidative color, because it meets the requirements for inability to support microbial life with the presence of the ammonia or monoethanolamine in the product. And generally, you also have a lot of solvents as well. For the hydrogen peroxide kills all organisms. So that's also kind of nice that you don't have to worry about preservation. Now, if you had a semi-permanent hair color that was in a more conditioning base, you would definitely need preservation because the pH isn't as high and there's an opportunity for microbial growth. So you would do preservative efficacy testing. But other than that, it's really simple because, again, we have such a huge understanding on the safety of these dyes and how they should be used and the ways they can be combined and where they can be put at. Once you know that, having a standard safety assessment is pretty easy on the product, and the testing really is kind of minimal.
And I would assume that the packaging for at-home hair dye is intentional as well. It always comes in those aluminum tubes, opaque, and I'm assuming because of light stability and probably package compatibility because of the high pH, everything else, correct?
Well, it's actually the oxygen factor. You don't want this product exposed to oxygen because the dyes oxidize together. And so you have to get rid of all of that. And usually if there's any air in the container, you inject nitrogen into the airspace to remove that from it. The plastic, if it's a liquid home hair color, it has to be a special kind of plastic to prevent oxygen from going through a container. It's actually really surprising all the things that oxygen goes through. And for permanent hair color, always comes in aluminum that's lined with some kind of liner, because again, it's just really easy to have that oxygen barrier in an aluminum tube.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm having a conversation later this week with somebody in terms of kind of plastic alternatives and sustainable packaging. And something that I encountered in selecting that was this oxygen vapor transfer rate that is different. Plastic is kind of a workhorse in terms of like that permeation. And so these alternate materials, you have to consider, like, do I have kind of an oxygen labile element in it? And so, I haven't seen a lot of innovation in terms of these permanent hair dyes, and that's the reason why the packaging
Yeah.
innovation.
Yeah. And we know what we have works. So,
Yeah. And in terms of your facility, you manufacture hair dyes, correct?
well, we are opening manufacturing for hair dyes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Right now we just formulate.
Okay. So, I mean, you're in it though. So, in taking everything we just talked about into consideration, there's going to be, it has to be in an environment that does not have oxygen. A lot of times, light stable, right? You're working with solvents maybe that have some health hazards. When it comes to manufacturing, how is it different than just an ordinary cosmetic product? What are some of the main differences you've found in building out this capability that a manufacturer and I don't actually know of too many manufacturers, and this might be why, because the logistics of it are very complex. And but in building out this feature, what have you found to be some significant differences in the facilities that manufacture cosmetics versus hair dye?
Well, I'll compare hair care to hair color. And the reality is you just have to have the right tank. So a shampoo, a conditioner, you could literally make in anything if you wanted to. But I would liken it to manufacturing with retinol. Retinol is not air stable, it's not light stable. And so you manufacture it under vacuum. Hair color is done pretty much the same way.
Okay. And is there anything in terms of combustibility, flammability that you have to consider also when batching?
No, not for hair color. If you were manufacturing hydrogen peroxide developer, which is also a very special skill set, which I won't be doing, you have to take that into consideration because hydrogen peroxide, is very, has lots of warning signs all over it. And generally, you have to be permitted to have significant quantities of all of these materials on your site, but no different than any other manufacturer, I would say, because, even in skincare, in color cosmetics, think like isododecane, for example, that is flammable. So that you can only have a certain amount on site, it has to be stored in a certain area. It's the same in that regard. It's just the know-how of how to care for what's in the tank in getting it into the tube.
I also curious about when you are creating these formulations, how many times have you just walked away fully, ruining a lab coat or something in terms of permanent dye
all my
development?
lab coats are destroyed pretty much. Because, the thing about hair color is you'll get it somewhere and you won't know it's there until the next day when it oxidized. And you're like, I thought I cleaned this up. And then there's like a big brown streak on something. Yeah. So pretty much nothing of mine is clean. I am really good at weighing out dyes though. And, they're powders. So they do get everywhere when you're weighing them. But I always prided myself in that you could walk in my lab and aside from the lab coat, not tell that I worked in hair dyes. So
nice. That's great. I want to go back a little bit to safety that you touch upon and, how these dyes are, widely studied. There is was animal testing that was required in order to have them approved in the marketplace. There has been articles published, I think recently, really taking a look at long-term impacts of hair colorant and trying to link them to a negative health outcome. Where do you think we are in terms of the science of studying repetitive application of dyes and how that might impact health?
I think it's pretty well established. If you look into the SCCS opinions on hair colorants, the actual dye stuffs that are used, it's really intensely scrutinized. And there have been a lot of attempts to take kind of this metadata in papers and say, well, it's, doing this and that for people. And I think that, correlation doesn't equal causation. And so you could ask those same people if they, use shampoo, and then you could say, wow, well, it must be what's in the shampoo, right? The truth is, if this were the 70s or 80s and you were asking this question to me back when we relied on just the Ames test for this types of information, maybe I would have a different opinion. But again, very heavily studied, much like fragrance compounds
Sure.
and much like preservatives are. And so I think from that respect, people can rest assured that hair color is using what is permitted. Now, from a sensitization point, that data is also out there. And so I think maybe we're understanding more and more how much of the population is actually sensitized.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's necessarily just from hair colorants. I think hair colorants get a bad rap, but a lot of dyes are also used in tattoo inks. And think of how many more people are getting tattoos now, more than ever. But once they color their hair, that's when they get the negative reaction. And then
Yeah.
they'll say, well, it's the hair color, that's unsafe. But the reality is the tattoo ink industry is not super regulated.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think it's I bring it up, but I do think in some degree that it's difficult to ascertain any health outcome because of how many products are used in. There's no way to study it in a vacuum, right? There's no way to be like, hey, for the next 20 years, you're only going to apply hair dye every 6 months, right? There's a lot of other additive ingredients to things that maybe increase permeation of dye through the skin that you're using, adjacently. So it can be very difficult to, I think, come to a conclusion. And I have, for instance, I have had a hairdresser who, really no longer uses certain hair dyes, wears gloves. And I believe that was more of a sensitization thing where it's just like, well, yeah, when you're dyeing people's hair without gloves on 5-6 times a day, your skin's probably going to have some contact dermatitis,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the reality of it. But when it comes to carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, teratogenicity, if there is any sniff of CMR, it's out. So I think, it's something that's going to continue to be watched. The industry is not complacent. They're very vigilant about safety, much like the fragrance industry is, and constantly, getting new pieces of information and making new restrictions. I think the hair color industry has a lot of eyes on it.
And in terms of consumer preferences and trends, I know you've mentioned that there isn't, a huge palette to work with in terms of colorants, but in terms of trends, what have you been seeing as emerging innovation or even consumer preferences?
I think a lot of consumers want ammonia-free hair color. And I think they feel ammonia is terrible for your hair because you can smell it. It's very offensive. But in terms of actual hair health, ammonia, I think, is probably a better choice over its alternative. There's really only a couple things you can use to create the environment, ammonia or monoethanolamine. And I think monoethanolamine provides a lot more long-term damage. It is a contact allergen.
Yeah.
It's a liquid. It always stays in the hair. Once it's in there, it's very difficult to remove all of it. And you have to use a lot of monoethanolamine to get not even on par efficacy as ammonia. So you're just exposed to a lot more of that material. And so that's one trend, we've seen it heavily even over the last 10 to 20 years. But I think
more of driven by a very singular data point, right? Of like, oh, it smells versus.
So it must be terrible, right? I understand for the salon professional, they have to be around it all the time. So that I certainly understand the trend if it came from that perspective. But from the skin contact and the damage that monoethanolamine does to hair, it's not my favorite alkalizer to use. It has a time and a place. For me, I would always like to reach for ammonia. But as far as color goes, color is, I think, a little bit longer lasting in hair than, let's say, color cosmetics. I know that the color pigment suppliers, every quarter they seem to have a new palette of shades based on trends reports. Like, oh, for spring, yellow is going to be. For summer, it's all about blues. And so you're constantly recycling these pigments in order what is seasonally trending, much like clothing and fashion. Hair moves a lot slower. So for several years, a cooler look was in. So toning down warmth in hair, using ashes and violets and having kind of that icy look to hair, even extending all the way into people having fake gray hair that was really icy looking. But now we're seeing a lot of warms. And I remember a few years ago, a salon professional told me, warm will never be in. And I was like, you just watch. And sure enough, now we have cowboy copper and everyone wants
Ooh,
to have
okay.
a golden touch to their hair, like butterscotch. And so that's kind of refreshing to see, but that'll recycle out. And then people may be back to neutrals or having, the mushroom hair look was in for a while, like this really taupey flat
Okay.
kind of look.
I thought you
Yeah.
meant
So
the shape, and I was like, I
I
can
hope
do.
not.
I mean, mine does that when it gets long. That's always my complaint. So I was like, I got that trend down. But yeah,
Yeah,
in terms of
maybe
color,
that'll be the case. Yeah, but the
exactly.
trends move a whole lot slower.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you still have people who don't want any warmth in their hair. There's a meme that circulates around all the time with the Grinch, whose fur is green, right? Which is like
Yeah.
the opposite of warm. And it's, a salon guest saying, "Oh, I still see so much red in my hair." And it's like the hair is green. So,
Yeah. Well, great. I know that you actually have an Instagram handle where you like to share information. I'd
I
love,
do.
yeah. Where can our guests find you to learn more about everything you do and hair care and hair dye?
So I'm actually one of the original cosmetic chemists on Instagram. It's how I landed the handle cosmetic_chemist. So
Oh,
I don't get on
dang.
there too
Okay.
much anymore. Yeah, I won't get into why. But, I was one of the OG people sharing life as a cosmetic chemist. And then I have a large salon professional following, but I still talk about stuff in the lab. And,
Yeah.
if you listen to the Beauty Brains podcast, you'll see some correlations with what we're talking about on the show. And what I'm doing. I have a bunch of hair product feedback that I'm going to post because for part of my work, I have to use a lot of the competitor products to see, oh, what are they doing? What are they
Hmm.
doing? And usually I'm not impressed, but sometimes there's a product and you're like, this is pretty good. I would buy it.
And in terms of the Beauty Brains podcast, where can people listen to that?
You can listen to it on Spotify or iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. We push it out to many platforms. All you have to do is search the Beauty Brains.
Awesome. And part of what I've started to do with guests is to hear from you directly in terms of, what you think the industry wants to hear and listen to about next. You probably already have to do this on your podcast, right? It's like, what's relevant? But in terms of your experience and what you're hearing, what do you think the industry is wanting to learn?
The industry, meaning young chemists, I would say, they really want tangible formulation tips, things they can take back to their work right away.
Okay.
I think too, people may not want to hear this, but I think they want to be challenged. It's no fun listening. Maybe it is fun listening and saying, I agree, I agree, I agree. But having your thought process challenged, like, oh, I never thought about it that way. I
Yeah.
never thought to try this or that, but I also never thought to think about a product's usage from that angle. I had the opportunity to learn all of the things I know about ingredients from a gentleman who started in the industry in 1960. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, Dr. Ron DeSalvo, but he really loved learning how ingredients were made, where ingredients came from. And it's interesting, what a supplier says an ingredient will do is not necessarily what an ingredient will do. So I was always challenged to say, okay, from him, the supplier says this, is it really doing this? And
Yeah.
taking the time, which I know we don't always have, to test this out and try
Hmm.
it in real life on myself or other people. And so I think people want to hear things that will challenge them and kind of hear the truth. And
Yeah.
so I think that's what people want to learn, but really tangible tips that kind of open up their minds.
Yeah. And this may be an unpopular opinion, maybe with some of the listeners, but something that resonates with me that is similar to you is that, we kind of got into the product development space with highly technical backgrounds. And so a lot of what I do, and sometimes people I interact with that maybe are on innovation or product management, and I look at what they've done and I'm like, oh, so you have a degree in philosophy. And I don't understand how you can do a good job in a role without having a strong foundation in looking at chemical composition, interactions, synergies, challenging the status quo in terms of, what a raw material supplier is telling you, saying, how many skin exfoliants did you use? Or, what condition was that tested under?
N equals 1 for this study.
Oh, yes. Yes. That's always fun too. Or brand, I think on a past episode, I anecdotally read a study that was done with brand enthusiasts. And it was like, well,
of course they're going to love it. Yeah. I mean, of course, marketing people, whether you're at a raw material company, a brand, they're going to want to say everything they can. And generally, those people don't have scientific backgrounds.
Sure.
And I think they're more, it's interesting because I used to think, oh, they'll say whatever they want to say. But I honestly think they believe everything they say as well, even if there's no data to stand behind it. And they really need to rely on the role of the chemist to help support them in something that's defensible. This is a highly litigious area of consumer product sales across many industries because brands say things that aren't true. And so if you can rely, if you're a brand marketer listening, if you can really rely heavily on your scientists to come up with the truth and make it something that people can get really excited about, that's great. If you're a formulator listening, chemist, scientist, try to meet your marketing people. Don't say, no, you can't say that. Yeah. But I wouldn't say that. Why don't you try these options that are still truths, but different ways of saying something? And so I think if we can collaborate better together, I think there's a more level set consumer expectation, but it is hard. And honestly, not even all formulating chemists have chemistry backgrounds either. That was a big surprise for me. And I think some people who, don't have a solid chemistry background, I think they really struggle when it comes to the hard stuff. And, being more familiar in chemistry, I think helps people get through some of the challenges in formulating work.
Well, great. Thank you for this conversation and also for your feedback at the end there. I think that will be, great. It's always a challenge to constantly have that friction, right, between an R&D and marketing team. And I know we've at Tagra talked multiple times about like, well, we should have a candid dialogue about that. And I'm like, I don't want to be the referee. So I liked the feedback you provided.
Yeah, you guys got to meet each other halfway. That's what it is.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.